So here's just going to be a quick video of what I see as a not yet ruled out method of it being a more cyclical type universe and avoiding the heat death hypothesis. So just a quickie, the heat death universe is the basic idea in thermodynamics where you run out of heat to do. And that works because if you have a hot and a cold object, then normally you see the energy from the hot object going into the cold object. And that goes in a three-dimensional, so every direction you can think of. Now, the other way around, cold to hot, where the cold gets colder, they say that's not allowed. That in thermodynamics, you don't see that happening in the real world, and it just never does. Likewise, they say if you have two objects that are the same temperature, you do not get one object just spontaneously getting colder and transferring its heat to the other one. So that is also not allowed. And normally that's where the story ends there. They say, well, that kind of results in eventually all the heat gets transferred and everything's the same temperature and you can't do anything. Except there are some loopholes in the real world that we live in that we see that don't fit into that model. And the exceptions generally still obey conservation of energy and everything else. But what happens is that we see different forms of energy are allowed to do that. So for instance, light can go and hit a cold object and heat up that object. You can transfer it. You can do that with electricity or other forms as well, whether it be nuclear or mechanical or magnetic. So what this means is that if you have two objects of the same temperature interacting with each other with different types of chemical energy, say chemical energy, things like that, then you can actually go from cold to hot. Both objects got hotter than they were spontaneously because of that internal energy that was converted from one form, nuclear, chemical, whatever, into another form, say heat energy. So that is allowed, and we do see that, whether it's batteries, exothermic chemical reactions, etc. Now that conversion from one form of energy to another extends that because then you have all these other different sources of energy that can be converted. It ends up, however, being like a stall tactic instead of a complete way out or completely a cyclical system. And the reason is that eventually it gets trapped by the nuclear forces. And that's because although fusion of lighter elements is a net energy output, fusion of heavier elements consumes more energy than you get out of it. So you're locking up that potential energy in the mass of the object. Now you have to then and that's about at iron that transition happens. And then you have to go much, much higher, all the way from like plutonium, uranium, things like that, to much, much higher larger ones where splitting it with fission starts to become a net surplus again. So there's this gap where you're building up more and more mass into these like basically energy sinks and stores that almost seems like it's trapped there, and you would have still ended up resulting with the heat death universe because everything gets sucked, trapped in these masses. And the exception that we get to that last mechanism is Hawking radiation. So Hawking radiation, you have a black hole, without getting too much into the mechanics of it, it gives off Hawking radiation. And as it does so, the black hole inside shrinks and shrinks. And that Hawking radiation and energy is conserved. So as that shrinks, that energy is sent out across the cosmos. And that means that no matter what the nuclear energy is, whether it's iron or thorium, magnesium, copper, it doesn't matter anymore because through Hawking radiation, all of the rest mass is converted back into Hawking radiation, electromagnetic radiation, light, just not in the visible range, but light. And then as that light goes out, it can have, like a solar sail, it can have kinetic energy, it can be converted into kinetic energy, it can hit objects like photovoltaic effect and get converted into electrical energy, it can hit objects and get converted into thermal energy, etc., etc., or like photosynthesis, chemical energy, and you've gotten out of that sink, and you're put now, all of it can now get eventually recycled and put back into potential for reuse. At least that's the loophole that hasn't yet been closed.